Okay, good morning, everyone. What I'd like to try and do is just summarize the sources, and I hope everyone will then have a busy Ben Azmanim with plenty of learning to do. Um, very, very briefly, we looked at the classical, the locus of where everything starts. We're not going to go through that again, but that's the Gemara in Beitzah, Daf Chaf Aleph, about in Zokven es menorah, that you can't set up the menorah. The menorah is made of chulios, of these structures that link together, and the menorah that fell down you can't set up, or you can set up. And the Gemara says a principle, ein Binyan BeKelim ve'ein VeStira BeKelim, which sounds like a principle, ironclad principle, nothing to talk about. And that's indeed how Rashi seems to understand it. However, we saw an array of Gemaras that, well, we didn't see all of the Gemaras inside, but we saw our Gemara, Daf Kuf Beis Amud Beis, in which the Gemara talks about Ayul Shufta B'Kafina, which seems to be an example of Binyan BeKelim, and seems to be a Machlokas Rav and Shmuel. We saw the Gemara earlier on Daf, what Daf was it? On Daf, the Gemara about Chovis and Sulia, sorry, I'm trying to find my own source sheets. Here we are. The Gemara on Daf, we saw the Gemara on Daf Kufbeis and Beis, but looked first at the Gemara in Ayin Daled on the base, the Gemara that speaks about the building of this wickerwork basket and the kilning of a clay pitcher. And we saw there the Machlokas Rashi Tosfos, whether one of the melachos involved is Boneh. And we're not going to have time to see, but there's another Gemara in Daf Kufbeis on the base, Daf Kuf Mem Vav Amud Aleph, very important Gemara, a Gemara in Eruvin. I printed the sources. Basically, they all chip away at this principle that ein Binyan BeKelim. So how do we resolve it? So Rashi doesn't really tell us how he resolves it. Perhaps he understands it to be a machlokus between sugyas, and there are side sugyas which play with the idea that there is binyan with kelim. Maybe it is a machlokus between Tanoim and Amoraim, but la halacha we paskin ein binyan bekelim, and therefore any sugya which doesn't tell us to the contrary, we should assume ein binyan bekelim. That's basically Rashi's approach. Tosfos in several places, and the Rosh and the Run and the Rashba, I printed all the sources, do distinguish between the scenarios in order to explain how to resolve these sources. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time today looking at how they distinguish between them. So basically speaking, I'm just going to summarize the sources. We have a Tosfos both on our sugya in Daf Kuf Beis and on Daf Ayin Daled, where Tosfos writes that when you are oisa legamrei kol hakeli mechayev mishum boneh. The difference is, are you making a keli legamrei, in which case you would be chayev mishum boneh, or are you not making the keli legamrei, not completely making the keli, in which case you would not be chayev mishum boneh. Now, it's not entirely clear just from those words if Tosfos's point is that the menorah was already made and then fell apart, or if his point is that the menorah was made of chulios. I'm picturing some sort of IKEA pack where you're just assembling components together. Or perhaps Tosfos is coming to distinguish a case where you're merely adding to a keli, like maybe our scenario. It's not entirely clear what Tosfos is saying as the core distinction. But basically he's saying, don't think that ein binyan VeStira BeKelim means there's no such thing as boneh. There is boneh, but with boneh on the ground, even if you just put two bricks together, even though nothing is completed and nothing is made, and you're putting parts together, that's enough. Whereas boneh with kelim, because kelim perhaps are less kosher or something like that, they're not mechubel karka, it's not a structure in the same way. Therefore, there's a higher threshold to be crossed in order to get binyan BeKelim. That's more or less Tosfos's language. Tosfos by us, by the way, adds in that he says ve'ein chiluk bein kelim lekarka. I'm now back to Tosfos, not in Ayin Daled, where Tosfos says, so again, the language of Tosfos in Daf Ayin Daled is osa keli legamri. Tosfos in our setting says, he begins like Tosfos in Ayin Daled. He says, "Omeri dahainu dafka bar zoras bati turisim b'mnor shel chulias av bin gomu machayiv BeKelim kamo bekaka." So he says similar language that It's only with the menorah of Chulias, this IKEA packed menorah, that there's in Binyan BeKelim. But if you do a Binyan Gomel, then there would be Kelim. Sounds a bit like Tosa $9. And then he adds in another svara. Ve'ein chiluk. At the end he says ve'ein chiluk ben Kelim lekaka elo b'makom she'ein chizuk v'umnus. Where the chiluk between Kelim and Kaka is where there's no chizuk v'umnus. To beklilo choshev binyan, or bakaka choshev binyan. With karka, you don't need chizuk v'umnus. So an amateur puts one brick on top of another. It's not even cemented in place. I mean, that's the continuation of the Gemara, that perhaps in some scenarios you don't even need cement to be put in place. And nonetheless, you're chayav. So there's no particular chizuk. It's not particularly strong. Nor is it umnus. There's no particular skill. Children put up two chairs and they spread a sheet across. Children like making tents for themselves. It's not particularly strong. There's no umnus in it. And nonetheless, you're chayav because it's karka type building. With the keli, there has to be chizuk the umnus. Is this a stira in Tosfos? Is this a contradiction in Tosfos? Clue, there's three possible answers. Yes, no, or I don't know, and I think all three are right. I'm not sure, and you could argue yes, you could argue no. In some senses, it is a stira in Tosfos, because Tosfos is saying a new principle. Before he said Binyan Gomor, and the language, particularly in Daf Ayin Daled, rings a little bit. K'shosa legamri kol hakli. So it sounds like the emphasis is on making a whole kli. So it sounds very different over here where he says chizuk v'umnus. It does sound like a different sort of svara. And practically speaking, I think if I gave you a series of thought experiment scenarios, you would come to a different halachic conclusion between these scenarios based on the two languages of Tosfos. On the other hand, conceptually, there is a bit of a similarity, because you can see why umnus and chizuk would cause something to cross the threshold of being a new product. Let's say, for example, you have a collapsible table, or a table where you just screw in the legs very easily. And it's made, something, you get a tabletop and you just screw in the legs. Or the menorah shel chulias, for that matter. What defines it as, am I making and constructing a new keli every time I put it together? Or is it not legamri making a new keli? Well, a good candidate for the threshold would be, if it's easy to do and it's not particularly locked in, then every time I'm just putting together something that already existed, and that wouldn't be called binyan. Whereas if it's complicated, do I need to call a professional in, or it's chazak, it's strong, then maybe that is called making a new keli. So in a sense, you could argue that chizuk and umnus is part of Tosfos' attempt to define what makes something a new keli, as opposed to just remaking something that already existed. So in a sense, Tosfos is a stira, because halacha l'maisa, it does draw you to slightly different conclusions, the two ways of formulating it. And then conceptually, I don't think the two formulations of Tosfos are on a different page, because arguably one is tweaking the other and attempting to understand what makes a kli legamri. So I don't know. Yes, no. I'm not exactly sure what to make of this. By the way, even within chizuk and umnus, there is a bit of a debate around the what Tosfos means. Does it mean both, either or? Also not entirely clear. One of the very interesting, because when you learn halacha, you also learn history. The technology of a screw, where something is screwed into place, is relatively new technology. By that I mean in Jewish terms new, about 400 years old. Meaning to say, the technology of a screw is a genius invention, because it sets up basically a system of tension where the direction where stress is put, which is, for example, pulling and pushing, is different to the direction where the weakness is, which is twisting. And therefore, you can very easily twist something into place without having to hammer it and fix it or glue it or use any other mechanism. Now, I have to confess, I never spent a long time thinking about technology or screwing until I learned the halachas a while back, this is, and came to realize that no posek discussed screwing something in place till I can't remember exact dates, till about 400 years ago, when this new high-tech invention arrived on the scene and took the world by storm, because it's brilliant. They knew about screws. They had Archimedes had screws on, but the idea of using it as a way of fixing and screw was a new piece of technology. Now, the poskim then began discussing how to view it, because if your criteria is chizuk, screwing is very, very strong. If your criteria is umnus, screwing is very easy. That's the whole point of it. It's easy. It's even easier than using a hammer and nail. It's really, really simple to do. So this is where, very interestingly, for sort of 500 years, to the best of my knowledge, no one really unpicked Tosfos' distinction between chizuk and umnus, because the two went together. And then as I said, about 400 years ago, people began querying the two, because the poskim that took the chizuk side said that screwing would cross the threshold of chizuk. It's a very, very strong way of binding things together. And the posting that took Umnus side said screwing is not Umnus, and this remains a flashpoint in Halacha, very interestingly. Okay, so basically what we've seen so far are two schools of thought. Rashi, who doesn't, to the best of my knowledge, resolve this contradiction, perhaps was prepared to live that it was a steer in sugyas, and the core sugya, the critical sugya, the determinative sugya, is the sugya that makes a principle out of this. Ein binyan v'stira BeKelim. All the other sugyas touch upon it, agav, and therefore they're not the controlling sugya. That's the word that academics use for this concept, the controlling sugya that determines halacha in this school of thought. And Tosfos basically says there is binyan v'stira BeKelim. All ein binyan v'stira BeKelim means not to the same degree as karka. Karka is so choshev that even a child stretching a sheet across chairs, or someone putting up a little canopy, or putting bricks on top of each other is binyan. And even chulias shel menorah is binyan. Even chulias, a prefab, would be binyan. And kelim are different. Kelim are only when it's a binyan gomel, and when it has perhaps a degree of expertise to it, or it's making something new and making something complete. The next source I want to look at outside, very briefly, is the Rashba. The Rashba says explicitly that the threshold is, are you making a new keli? Do we know where the winding things are for these windows? Are they over here? If there's trouble, someone just go through the windows. Sorry, thank you. The others are all closed. I think it's just these ones that are. There's also this up here. Yeah, that's done. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's closing. Excellent. Thank you. Sorry. Oh, that's I can think again. Okay. So the Rashba says explicitly, again, I'm just highlighting the things I wanted to bring out. The Rashba says, "Lasis kli lechatchila einacha binyan gadol mezeh." Making a new keli einacha binyan gadol mezeh. That's thing. Aval binyan gomor mechayiv BeKelim k'mei bekarka. Binyan gomor is chayiv. Sorry, I'm misreading. Ve'ein ze nikla binyan BeKelim. This is not called binyan BeKelim. Sharainu Boneh kli ela osa kli. You're not building it, you're not just doing anything, you're making a kli. Okay, so the Rashba says very beautifully that we need to be medayik the language of the Gemara, ein binyan BeKelim, but there is a siyah BeKelim. Very interesting way of reading the principle, but I think he's in the same school of thought as Tosfos. Okay, so Shittas Rashi is not to resolve the contradiction. Shitta of Tosfos is degrees of building, and it's a little bit hard sometimes to define what the critical criteria is, and the Rashba reads it into the language of the principle. By the way, there would be enough gemina between these reasons, perhaps, and this ties into Tosfos. If you just focus on Tosfos' language of chizuk, the umnus, then if you add onto a kli something with chizuk and umnus, you would be chayiv. Whereas if you go with the language of Tosfos and Ein Daled and the Rashba, where the critical, and the earlier part of our Tosfos in Daf Kuf Beis, where the critical feature is asiyas kli legamri, and it's only baking a new kli, but maybe not adding on to a kli. So there's a variance in the nuances. Does this fit? I know I loaded you with tons and tons of sources, but does this approximately fit where people are going? I'd simply urge you to go through the sources. Unfortunately, the time has meant that we're not able to go through this. This is our last session. We're not able to go through all the sources inside, but I hope that gives some indication. The final view I want to look at is the Run, and I printed the Run. The Run says that a kli godol yesh binyan v'stira BeKelim, and the Gemara is talking about a kli cotton, a small kli. There's no binyan v'stira BeKelim. A big kli there is. It's hard to understand what the Run means by big and small, and it's hard to understand why that should make a difference. However, the Beis Yosef brings a Trumas Hadeshen, and I printed the Beis Yosef, and the Trumas Hadeshen says the threshold is 40 sar, 40 sar, and basically he explains that when you get a very, very large keli, it becomes like a structure, like a building, rather than a keli, and that's the chashivas. The point of why ein binyan v'stira BeKelim is because kelim are little portable things, whereas something very big is a structure. It's changing, if you like, the geographical space of the world, and that's binyan v'stira BeKelim. Let me just give you an example. Outside in our courtyards, we've just put up a porter cabin. What is a porter cabin? Well, arguably a kli. It's not. It doesn't have foundations. It's not built on the ground. You've just dumped a very large box on the ground. Nonetheless, there's a certain threshold where things become binyanim rather than kelim. A boim sar, 40 sides, about the area that a person can crouch underneath. Perhaps the area of the area under the table over here that I'm sitting in front of. It's the smallest shiur of a mikveh. It's the sort of area that person can crouch in. A fridge, a chest freezer, is perhaps a boim sar. And you can sort of see that when you get to kelim that are that size, they are more structural. They get left in place. They don't get moved around ever really unless you're cleaning. They become part of the kitchen design. They're not just, the Magimix and the kettle you put in the kitchen. The fridge, the freezer, the oven is part of the construction of the kitchen. I don't want to appeal too much to intuition because intuition can lead one astray in legal reasoning and halacha. But that's the sort of ballpark area in which the run is operating as explained by the Trumas Hadeshen, as explained by Rabbi Zobin. I don't think the Trumas Hadeshen references the run. He doesn't reference the run, in fact. He definitely doesn't reference the run. But the Rabbi Zobin is linking the sort of two and helping us understand this far. So this is a third distinction. There is one other really important halachic concept that comes up, which is the Gemara in Kuf Mem Vav Omid Aleph, where the Gemara says, "Shoyve Odom es ha-chovis." A person can smash a chovis. Now, there's two or three important features from that Gemara, and again, I'm just trying to summarize the sources and highlight. And this is a Mishnah. Sorry, I read that a Mishnah, but that Mishnah and Gemara are very, very important. And all I want to say from that is the following: it introduces another couple of halachic features which are relevant. Feature number one is from that Gemara emerges a concern around even if ein binyan VeStira BeKelim, nonetheless, if you make a spout, there may be a prohibition of so doing because of makeh b'patish. So when you make a keli, besides wondering about binyan BeKelim, we always have to worry about makeh b'patish. And it's possible that if you create a spout in a keli, for example, that or good entrance, a good opening in a keli, that's also a melachot, not because of Boneh, because maybe ein binyan VeStira BeKelim, but because of makeh b'patish. The second thing that emerges in that Gemara is a question. Why can you smash this chovis if yesh binyan VeStira BeKelim? In the same way as you can't create a keli, surely you shouldn't be able to destroy a keli. So according to the Rishonim, who belong to the school of thought, that creating a keli is a melacha. It's just tweaking a keli that isn't a melacha, or something like that. But if you make a new keli that's a melacha, then surely if you destroy a keli, that should also be a melacha. And that school of thought, those Rishonim, the run, introduce a concept called mustaki. Mustaki meant a very poor quality keli. It's basically little bits of earthenware that are glued together, stuck together very weakly. And they say the Mishnah's talking about such a chovis, a very low quality, disposable, cheap chovis. So to summarize where we have got up to, we now have the founding principles of all discussions about making kelim. We have a Gemara that says ein binyan VeStira BeKelim. Arguably, there never is binyan VeStira BeKelim. Rashi's view. We have a run in Trumas Hadeshen that says a large keli has binyan VeStira BeKelim. We have a Tosfos and a Rashba that say it depends on whether you're making it anew or whether it involves expertise. Maybe the same view, maybe a slightly different view. And then we have a run that tells us that mustaki allows the keli. There's no principle of binyan VeStira because it's just a disposable type keli. And then we have a raising of awareness of the concept of a very cheap, flimsy keli about which, mustaki, very cheap, flimsy keli about which there were no binyan kelim, and then raising awareness of we also always need to think about makeh b'patish, such as making a spout. We now have the main building blocks in place for the source sheet I will put on the group later today, which is not my own source sheet. I've cribbed it off someone else, but it's basically a cut and paste from all the poskim in the 20th century that discuss opening cans of tuna, opening in Israel these sacks of milk, opening packages of chocolate, opening cartons, opening bottle lids, and all these questions. They all basically work with these principles that we've said. And all I wanted to do today, in a sense, was take us on a tour of these primary sources. So far, so good. Is it too much of a whirlwind, or this is okay? Okay, I want to spend the last 10 minutes saying two final points. First final point is exploring the view of the Rambam and a very, very interesting Moshe Feinstein on this matter. Not particular ramifications halacha l'maisa. It does have some niche ramifications, but not major ramifications halacha l'maisa. And the second thing I want to do is look at how the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah paskin, and with that we will finish our whirlwind overview of a massive sugya that, as I said, to be honest, I've been ducking for years because I couldn't quite cope with it, but realised that I need to be brave in life and sometimes bite off things that are very challenging. This is a challenging sugya. You just see the array of sources. It's just quite overwhelming. Very interesting what makes sugyas become so massive sometimes, but that's the way it is. Okay, I gave out on the group and printed Rambam. Very briefly, there is a stira in the Rambam. And again, actually, I'm not going to look at it inside just because of time pressure. I just want to summarize it. The Rambam says in Perek Yud Halacha Yud Gimel, actually we'll read it, if you make a kli adama, could go in tano, v'chovis, etc. How is that told us Boneh v'chayev? And so the Rambam carries on. Implication of the Rambam that he holds yesh binyan v'stira BeKelim. Either the Gemara says ein binyan v'stira BeKelim, I don't know. Either he doesn't paskin like that, or he agrees with Tosfos and the Rashba and everyone else that if you genuinely make a kli or chayev, ein binyan v'stira BeKelim means tweaking kelim or disposable kelim or prefab kelim, but it doesn't mean when you're making a keli from the start. That's how the Rambam paskins. And he's explicitly picking a fight with Rashi, who said that that in the case of the chovis, you're not chayiv mishum boneh when you kiln or make the chovis because of ein binyan v'stira BeKelim. Okay, so the Rambam is very clear. The Rambam haskins yesh binyan v'stira BeKelim or ein binyan v'stira BeKelim, but there isn't in when you make a keli, like the Rashba very beautifully said in the language of the Gemara, ein binyan BeKelim, but there is a siyas keli. Okay, then we have another Rambam, which is coming off the back of the Gemara in Kuf Mem Vav that I mentioned, shova odom chovis. And the Rambam paskins in Perek Kaf Gimel Halacha Beis, shova also odom chovis. You can smash a chovis. Now, we said that if you hold that making a keli is a malacha, surely destroying a keli is a malacha, because it's the same significance of outcome. So how can the Rambam just say shova odom chovis? Now, the Rishonim answered the question. They said that Gemara is talking about a mustaki, this disposable keli, very weakly made keli. But the Rambam just paskin stam shova odom chovis. Surely bone and sosa are symmetrical. If in any scenario where ein binyan v'stira BeKelim, 1 second, in any scenario where ein binyan BeKelim, then also ein stira BeKelim. But in any scenario where yesh binyan BeKelim, for example, you're making a kli from nothing to a kli, surely yesh stira BeKelim, if you make a kli back down to nothing, that should also be the melacha. So how can the Rambam say shova odom es hachovis? Now it's true that there are other conditions to melachas stira, for example, amanas livnos and so on, but the Rambam doesn't go into that, nor does he imply that there is a drabanon over here. Normally stira, even if it's not amanas livnos and it's deemed makalkal or the like, there's still an issa drabanon. The Rambam doesn't specify that in the way that we would want him to do either. He just says, did I print the right Rambam? Maybe I hope I did.
You did include the almanac in the sense, shelo yikaven lasot kli.
Shova odom chovis. Yeah, I did print the one. Lechon many grogos, eventually is chaven says kli, etc. Yeah. So what exactly is if it's almanas lasis kli? The Rambam says yes, but otherwise he seems to say that chilo you can destroy, and he doesn't mention anything about mustaki and ein binyan v'stira BeKelim. So this is the stira in the Rambam. And all I really want to just draw your attention to is there's a very, very long shuvah of Ramosha, which has, I printed just one of the branches. If you have a look at it inside, it's got multiple branches, very, very long shuvah. All I really want to say is just one svara that he says, very, very interesting one-liner in Ramosha. And he says, I don't really understand this distinction, but I just want to point out mathematically that maybe ein binyan v'stira BeKelim, according to the Rambam, means if you're doing a malacha in a keli, there isn't the melacha of Boneh. So let's think, says Ramosha. If I'm taking pieces, they are not kelim, and I make them into a keli, I've done a melacha in a non-keli to construct it into a keli. Therefore, you'd be chayev. However, when you dismantle something, a keli, by definition, I'm always dismantling a keli, and therefore I'm doing a melacha in a keli, and therefore there is no melacha. So again, Ramosha is saying, I'm not really sure, says Ramosha, what the logic behind this is, but if you want to be sort of very pedantic and precise about this rule of ein binyan v'stira BeKelim, when you make a keli, you are doing a work, a melacha, a creativity in a non-keli to make it into a keli, and that would be deemed a melacha, because it's not binyan BeKelim. If you're adding to a keli, for example, maybe that would be a melacha in kelim. When you're dismantling a keli, by definition, you're always doing an act of dismantling a keli, and therefore it's always a melacha in a keli. Now, Ramosha set me thinking about the following thought. I don't know if this is right or wrong, take it or leave it. I just want to put it on the table for everyone to think about, which is as follows. I always assumed that a keli is a chashivas. A keli is a very chashiv thing. It's a functional item for humans to use. Maybe being a keli is a weakness. What do I mean by that? If we're looking at Boneh as moving bits of the raw universe around, when I make something into a keli, it ceases to just be about parts, about raw material, and its chashivas now morphs into becoming my functionality, my servant. Remember everything we said in Muktzah, keli is a servant of human beings. Maybe the lomdus of the Gemara, according to this svara, is that we should no longer view this as pieces and putting pieces into place, chunks of the fabric of raw material, but we should see this as a keli. It's now my servant, it's my device. And maybe as far as Boneh is concerned, Boneh is a construction melacha. Boneh is about buildings, about constructing. Maybe making it into a kli, it diminishes the chashivas of the object. Because I'm making something, it has a functionality, but a form, but the matter, the raw material now is less important in this. Again, a piece of lomdus that we always speak about is, to what degree do we look at matter or raw material, or chomer, to what degree do we look at form and functionality? You know, what's more similar to each other? A wood stump and a wooden bench, or a wooden bench and a metal bench. And as far as raw material is concerned, wood and wood. As far as functionality is concerned, kelim is concerned, the metal bench and the wooden bench. A keli is interesting because it ceases to be significant in terms of the fabric of construction of the universe, of the raw world, and the significance becomes in terms of subjective human needs and usefulness. And normally, Masechet Shabbat are obviously about human needs, but maybe the uniqueness of Boneh is human needs in terms of what's different about karka. Why is karka more chashuv than a keli? What's this intuition that a building, like let's say that Tosfos has and the Ran has and all the Rishonim has, that somehow a building is more chashuv than a keli? Well, the answer is because the building is structural. The keli is less structural. Maybe the Rambam understood this conceptually. Even if I move bits around which aren't yet a keli, pieces of raw matter, that's still structural, that's still constructional. But when it's a keli, my servant, my subjective human needs, it loses the chashivas of being a construction project. It could be a different melachot, it could be weaving, it could be makeh b'patish, but Boneh not. And therefore, you have Ramosha's logic. We need to look at what am I doing? If I'm putting pieces together, and as a result of that, they'll become a keli. But at the moment I'm moving pieces together, that would be the melacha. When I'm doing sosa, by definition, when I'm dismantling a keli, I'm always dismantling pieces which are, as of the moment now, a keli, and therefore there wouldn't be a melacha in the keli. I want to finish off just one final point, so please forgive me for rushing, and I'm not pausing for questions or thoughts around here. I simply want us to read together a Shulchan Aruch, and I find this very interesting because it's a very nice example of how careful one has to be when reading Shulchan Aruch to work out what the Shulchan Aruch means. And here I call on you to turn to page 7 in the handouts, and I want us to read the Shulchan Aruch without the Ramah and with the Ramah. And one of the difficulties of the Ramah in my philosophy show on Sunday mornings, actually, I've been interestingly looking at the Ramah and the Beis Yosef for Beis Zakari, how they co-authored the Shulchan Aruch. And one of the editorial decisions the Ramah took was to weave his language into the text of the Shulchan Aruch. But let's read the Shulchan Aruch without the Ramah. Ein Binyan VeStira BeKelim. Ein Binyan VeStira BeKelim. V'hani mili, this is she'eina binyan mamish, where it's not a proper building, k'mo chovis, shenishbra, v'dibik shvarel zefes. A mustaki, a broken chavis, where you glue together the pieces, basically what we'd call now a weak disposable keli. That's the mustaki that we saw. That's how the Ran explains shove chavis, and all the Shulchan Aruch is saying is, well, similarly, you can build such a chavis. You can build a chavis which was broken pieces glued together. You can smash on Yom Tov and on Shabbos, and you can build on Shabbos. Therefore, yochol l'shavra, you can break it. Likach memenu masher b'sochel v'ad shelo yichavin l'nakva nekev yofer. That's makeh b'patish. Aval im hi shalema, if it was complete, also the shavra and huadin, you can't build it. So the mechaber, the Shulchan Aruch, is paskening in the realm of Tosfos and the Rashba and the like, that the critical factor is, am I making a whole kli that is solid and strong, or am I engaging with something weak? Something around that ballpark is how the Shulchan Aruch is paskening. The Ramah weaves into this the Trumas Hadeshen or the Ran, in which he says it depends on how large it is. Is it a large keli or a small keli? And we discussed this 40 saw. When a keli becomes big enough, it ceases to be a keli, it becomes a porta cabin, it becomes a building, a structure of sorts. Now, three possibilities in reading the Ramah. Is the Ramah adding to the Shulchan Aruch's conditions and explaining the Shulchan Aruch? In other words, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah would both agree you need two conditions. You need it to be large and solid. Is the Ramah arguing with the Shulchan Aruch? He says, I think you need large and solid, but the Shulchan Aruch means only solid. Or is the Ramah arguing completely and saying the only criteria is large and nothing else matters? Are you with me? The Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah adds a sort of note into the Shulchan Aruch. He adds it so that you can read it, but we have to be careful. That if you read the Ramah, the Shulchan Aruch is like this: Ein binyan v'stira BeKelim, v'hani mili she'eina binyan mamish, k'goin chovis, which is a small thing. She'eina machzekas habayim sa. If you have a big binyan, a big keli, you wouldn't be allowed to build it. Does the Ramah mean to add that onto the Shulchan Aruch, but in conjunction with it being flimsy? But if it's solid, that would be enough to be mechayiv you, or if it's big, it would be enough to be mechayiv you? Or, in other both conditions, or is the Ramah saying the only criteria is size? And I disagree with Tosas and the Rashba and all the other chilukim that say that things depend on solidity of construction and the like. Have a look in the Mishnah Berurah, have a look in the Gon. The post can basically argue over this. The Gon, for example, is of the view that the Ramah holds Ein binyan v'stira BeKelim, and it's only large kelim that have the criteria of building. That's the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so we've run out of time. We're going to stop. We're going to stop here for today. All I would say is I hope if this was a little bit overwhelming, please listen to the recording. I've tried to give you a tour of the main sources that I wanted to look at, and how the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah arguably come to a conclusion. I will post on the group, but not my own sources, but sources that I found online, that sort of cut and paste. If you want to have real, just see the beauty of Torah and clear Torah presentation, learn the Rebbe Ovadia Yosef, really stunning piece where he summarizes everything on the sukkah so nicely and beautifully, in terms of the shaila about opening cans and tuna and the like. There's a Chazon Ish that talks about it. It's a nice example of where habits have changed. In the Chazon Ish's era, writing Bnei Brak in the late 40s, poverty was rampant, and he says that people open tins on Shabbos. They keep the tins so that they can store things in the tin afterwards. And the later post can point out that no one keeps tins or cans nowadays. Really, really interesting. Just to go halacha l'maisa for, you're probably all aware the different rabbanim will tell you different things about it. There's no area that there's so much machlokas about in common day use as this issue of, can you open bottle lids on Shabbos and the like. I hope you've seen the Rishonim on it enough to understand the principles, and have a look at the Shmir Shabbos Kolchasa and the Chazon Ish and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman and so on. I think it's a nice Bein Hazmanim project to help you out sitting there in your relaxing in the summer weather. I wish everyone a good Bein Hazmanim, I suppose, and looking forward to resuming in Elul. Thank you very, very much.
Absolutely big Ashkar for Dan Zobin for amazing time again.